We've partnered up with feminists and activists that are making real change in GCC countries, and we've invited speakers over so that we can create safe spaces where we can have these actual discussions. But before we get to our speakers, I'm going to give you the agenda for the day, which is to ask our speakers three rounds of questions about migration, disabilities, and gender, and how these intersectional factors impact people in gaining access to basic human rights that we aren't highlighting enough. So I'm going to start with my partner, my Sisters in Solidarity and partners, Takatoat, and they're going to introduce themselves, and we'll also introduce the other partners within the other work that we're doing within Sisters in Solidarity.
Hi everyone, I'm Aya. Nice to have you here today. I'm Aya. I'm one of the co-founder of Takatoat. Takatoat literally means intersectionalities in Arabic, and based on the intersectionality principle. And it is the first non-governmental independent feminist collective based in Jordan and led by 5 ladies from different journeys and experiences. Our mission, and we conduct now many campaigns and activities related to gender-based violence and spreading feminist knowledge and with its all means and forms. One of our activities is this collaboration with the Voicing Voices, Sisters in Solidarity. And yeah, this event is our first event, and I'm so excited and so happy to have you here today. We're tackling so many topics and issues from all over the world. I hope you enjoy, and yeah, thank you.
We have our sisters in Qatar that are working with us to make sure that we stand in solidarity against injustices. So we're going to introduce our speakers who will give you an insight on who they are, what they're doing here, and what they also wish to share with you during this discussion. So we'll start with the lovely Haya.
Hello all. I'm happy to be here with you. Thanks, Ayan, and thanks, Aya, Voicing Voices and Takatoat, and also our feminist sisters in Qatar for this initiative. My name is Hayat Mershad. I'm a journalist and a feminist activist from Lebanon. I've been working on advocating for women's rights since more than 13 years, and I'm a proud, loud feminist. I always like to introduce myself this way.
Thank you. And then we'll do Vani.
Hi, I'm Vani. I'm a journalist and human rights advocate. I used to be in mainstream journalism and moved to advocacy. I've lived in Qatar for about 17, 18 years, from 1999 onwards, and continue to work in the region, in the wider Gulf region, on issues related to human rights of labor migrants. I work with an organization called migrantrights.org, which is an advocacy organization started by a young, brave Bahraini activist when she was just in her teens, as a blog, and then it has now grown into one of its kind bilingual advocacy portal. We also do a lot of grassroots work. I've been thinking about, the feminism and the role we play deliberately only in the last few years, but I'm the youngest of 4 daughters in India. And I don't want to get into the cultural aspects of it, but you can just imagine, I'm 47. So 47 years ago, there's yet another daughter so in the family. So that is the environment I came into, but I was surrounded by strong women. I took a lot of things for granted because I was surrounded by strong women. I went to an all-girls college, all-girls university. So it was always this thing that women could do anything. But then when I became a mother, and then I had to start depending on other women to help me out, is when the realization came up about how me by myself can achieve little in the environment we live in unless other women step into support and other men step into support as well. So I came to migrant rights basically looking at what was happening around me in Qatar, but also with a personal experience. I don't want to go into details, I'll just post a link, of hiring a live-in domestic worker and how exploitative that was to her, to have me as an employer and roommate and a housemate 24/7. So that kind of influences a lot of what I do now, learning from my own mistakes, but also having conversations with people.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And Amal, please introduce yourself.
Hi everyone. Hi, and yeah, thank you for having me. Wait, can everyone hear me? Just raise your hand.
You're perfect.
All right. I don't know where to start. So I'm a disability rights advocate, and part of that, I content create just to represent and normalize people with disabilities through media, because media has been one of the very big tools used throughout the 80, 60 years of the mainstream media of dehumanizing people with disabilities, and I'm using that platform to humanize them and normalize them back into society. I became an activist accidentally, to be honest, because I was 10 years old when I was taken out of education. I'm 22 right now. I never received my education, but I self-taught myself. And I started using social media basically when I was 14. But I watched a lot of journalists, so that helped me figure out how to use that platform to raise awareness. And then I used that to get people with disabilities and Doha, and eventually the word grew around the GCC on my story, and it helped other schools make themselves accessible to the students, because it is economically and socially progressive to have children with disabilities integrated into the mainstream school system. So that's basically what I did till now, these 6-7 years. So that's it. So thank you, everyone.
That's a lot. So thank you. And we're so excited to actually go deeper into that story, because I know it's very, very inspiring. And lastly, but not least, a very dear friend of mine and someone that has inspired me so much, Melissa Candido.
Hello, all. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be amongst so many amazing women. So thank you for that, Ayan. I'm an educator. I'm a poet. I'm a mother. I'm a daughter. I'm a dancer. And I try very purposefully to bring voice and agency into my classroom, both through fiction, but also nonfiction. And I teach English, but English meaning language and literature. So how do we engage the world through the accessed information that comes through what we read and how we read it, from media bias to regular, as we call it, books. But I think it's a really important thing that you're doing through Voicing Voices, because it is the aspect of what does it mean to have a voice, and what does it mean to use our voice, and when do we allow others space and place to amplify, and when do we pass the microphone, and how do we encourage and bring more people to that space where we can hear them. So thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. So we're going to go dive in now to the main juicy parts, and we're going to start with you, Miss English teacher, and you're going to help define intersectionality for us, because that is the title of our event today, and how it interlinks with human rights. So a nice introduction for us, please, Melissa.
So I would call that a PhD level dissertation type of question. It's pretty broad. And as I understand, I only have 5 minutes, so obviously I won't get into all of it. But Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term in 1989 in terms of intersectional feminism, and it's just a prism that we can view forms of inequality which can exacerbate and change and layer on top of each other. And when we think about how that interlinks with education, the Article 26 of UN is the right to education, and we're talking about access, and we're talking about free, and free can be economically an interesting conversation in and of itself. But part of that, Article 26 says to the full development of the human personality. And I think that part gets forgotten quite a bit, because we're not just talking about one part of a person called their brain. We're talking about everything that comes with that human personality, from all of the ways that we are able to bring forth our understanding. And I think that all of those parts that are intersectional layer on top of each other. And when we think about that within an educational field, I'm not there just to educate a single being that is a monolith. And we forget sometimes that all of the things that we want to identify as all of the parts of us and make us unique are different in and of each other. And I think with our intersectionality, we also have to give, again, voice to where our students, which okay, let me rewind a little. There's this concept that the children are the future, and I disagree with it, because I think the children, regardless of age, are now. I'm not waiting for them to graduate to engage. I don't think that they need to have a high school diploma or a college diploma to engage with life. I think they should be doing it now, because I'm not waiting for this make-believe future. And so when I'm teaching and I'm thinking about ways to address education intersectionality, we are talking about asking a lot of questions and asking why things are the way they are. And so when we're able to ask a lot of questions and bring forth the voices of each student, that allows us to have discourse and conversation, that there is no right answer as we're studying. There's multiple truths. And when you think about intersectionality, I think a very antiquated way of looking at education is that there's a right answer, or that there's one side of history that is the winner. And we only know about the victors, not the vanquished. And I believe that when we bring forth the vanquished voices, whether we have to dig a little harder for them sometimes, or we have to look for them because they've been silenced purposefully, then we're able to bring that idea to light and stop pretending that things don't exist just because they were silenced.
We are actually going to go to a follow-up from that. That was very insightful, and it's so important. We have Nawal, who I would like to ask, how would you compare your access to education compared to other students?
So Melissa brought up a very good point, that a lot is focused on the future instead of what's happening right now. One of the big things, okay, so depending on the side of the world you're in, like say in the GCC specifically, what I have noticed around from what I know, like in Doha or Oman, etc., that basically I'm just going to focus in Doha because of my experience here, is that basically there's no law that stops schools from discriminating a child in the first place, right? So if there's no accountability, then we're not able to report. If there's no center I can go and report, then that school cannot be held accountable, and there's nothing holding them accountable. So I think in the education system, that my experience was, first, there was no awareness of visible or invisible disability, right? Because I had an invisible disability when I was in school. So firstly, there is lack of awareness, there is lack of policies and laws that hold those accountable, who try to, even though in Doha, the public schools are held accountable, but the private schools are not. So they're not inspected, they're not met through those international accessibility standards. So those were my experiences as a child. And I think just to, sorry, there's a lot to swallow in there. So this is one of the big things, and that, if what I realized also with parents throughout years, that if we went to the Ministry of Education or one of the education leads, they had two different places that the parents are not taken seriously. So even when the parents do want to report it, that their child is being discriminated just because of the basis of disability, like no one does anything. And another spectrum in education wise, just from my experience, that a physical disability is automatically seen. If you have a physical disability, you are automatically put with children that have Down syndrome or children in the autism spectrum, when these are two different needs experiences, what I have noticed, and also what I noticed, there's been improvements for the past couple of years, but that was out of the hardcore awareness in newspapers and conversations. And that's like their improvements, but there's still a long way to go. And I think the best place to start is encouraging laws that hold these perpetrators accountable. That's the first place to start.
And our next speaker is Vani. We've looked at how age and youth affects inequalities. We've seen how disabilities affects inequalities. Vani, how does migration contribute to these inequalities as well, specifically in gender equality and what you have seen?
Thank you, Nawal, and thank you, Melissa. This was really interesting. And of course, there's a lot of stuff that overlaps with what I have to say. I wouldn't say migration in itself contributes to gender inequalities. In fact, to a degree, migration reduces that inequality in a certain place and for certain groups of people. What it does, because of the nature of the employment, the immigration regime that is, in question, it worsens existing inequalities. That's what migration does. It doesn't, in my analysis, it doesn't really throw up new levels of inequalities. It just worsens the environment that currently exists. So we see a lot of women who migrate. It is aspirational, not just for a better life for their families, but also to improve their own status in communities that are often very patriarchal, the origin countries. It's another fact that they move to countries that are equally patriarchal. But it provides them economic freedom, it provides them exposure to different cultures, and they do seek and gain new skills. So there is so much to be gained through migration. Women whose first migration experience may not have been stellar, but they learn coping mechanisms. They acquire skills to change it the next time around. They become peer educators quite organically. They become leaders in their community without any big design. They just do it because, use this whole thing, sisters in solidarity. That's exactly what you will see amongst migrant women. They're sisters in solidarity. They're constantly helping each other to escape, unideal living environments. But their resilience, or what they make of difficult situations, should not normalize what often is extremely abusive or exploitative experiences. Because we often hear this in the Gulf. It's better here than where they come from, as if that were an absolute fact or truth, or as if it were a good enough justification to treat someone poorly. As if being separated from one's family and children and all things familiar is not a huge price to pay. So you disregard all that and you want to have a flat narrative saying it's better in the Gulf than where they come from. The work women do in general is, of course, underpaid and undervalued. We all know that. And even in professions that are valued, there is a gender wage gap. But just take all of these inequalities and drop that into this pool of domestic work. If you take Gulf states, for women, at least migrant women, the majority are employed in domestic work, and it is the most exploitative sector in the country. And though it is considered essential work, that's a favorite phrase everybody throws around, it is not included in the labor law. It is not recognized as work and not included in labor laws of any of these countries. They have a separate niche, a tick box exercise of a domestic worker law that does nothing to promote them. What Gulf states have done is, in lieu of making available public welfare facilities like child or elderly care, they make it easy and cheap for families to recruit and employ and house women from impoverished countries with little or no accountability of how they're going to be treated. So there's a monopoly of living domestic work. But employing a domestic worker is not a right, it's a privilege we enjoy. And we forget that that privilege cannot come at the cost of someone else's rights. What is equally important is to understand that domestic workers, migrant domestic workers, are here to not lessen the burden on families alone, but particularly to lessen the burdens of women of the household. So we have to get to that root of that problem, where the household chores are seen as women's things. So you might be wealthy, you might be well educated, hold a really good career, But somehow managing the house, managing the children falls on you. So you outsource that to a domestic worker. There's a dependence. You also see a dependence on domestic workers where young women, young collegiate women, for them to have mobility, to have a level of freedom to go out and meet others, they're often accompanied by their nannies, adult women accompanied by their nannies, because it's the only way they can break that. So we need to explore how women in general are treated in those countries before we start talking about how migrant women are treated and how migrant domestic women are treated. I mentioned at the beginning that migrating for a job can change women's lives for the better. It does. But we shouldn't ignore the circumstances of what, under which that migration takes place, particularly for low income jobs. The decision, from what I've seen, traveling widely in origin countries, is not primarily that of the woman, the fathers, brothers, husbands, the local recruitment agents who dangle the carrot. They make that decision. They push women into ill-informed decisions to migrate. They know that they're going to the Arab, but they don't know which country. They think they're going to Dubai, but they end up in Kuwait. That's the level of knowledge that they have. And then they don't know how to adjust. They don't know what work is required. So ill-informed migration does not have an impact just on the individual, but also on their families. The reason that this happens is women are not in policy-making roles. Women are not the decision makers within governments. Women are not the ones implementing these laws. So you have people disconnected from the issue, designing policies and implementing it. So it's never going to be fair. It's never going to be well received by the women who suffer the indignities that happen during migration. Um, and then you have the other constituent of migrants, who are the women left behind, the wives, the daughters, the mothers of migrant workers, who are separated for several years from their significant other, children who grow up without their fathers, wives who live without their husbands. So what is that? That is, there's no dignity in labor, that if you don't earn enough, you don't have a right to a family life. You're separated from your family based on class. So these are all of the intersectional issues that we need to start addressing, not just from the Gulf's perspective, but also from the origin country's perspective. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Haya. Take us away there. And my question to you is, how do you think the language we use influences gender-based violence?
As mentioned by all the speakers, sexual and gender-based violence affects millions of people around the world, and the majority of whom are women, girls, and the gender minorities, and the most vulnerable, refugees, domestic workers, people with disabilities. So it is prevalent in times of peace and also in times of conflict, and it is directly tied to these structural inequalities between genders, in specific, the domination of men over women, with the protection, of course, of the patriarchal norms, attitudes, laws, and system. So despite its widespread nature, very few victims receive the protection and recognition and also the justice that they need. And I totally agree, Ayan, here, language plays a vital role in this. So while words can give and help survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, give them visibility, also truth and justice. Yes, to give them visibility, truth, justice, and it also, on the other hand, it can help discriminate and re-victimize and also destroy many victims. So it is crucial to use the right way, words in the right way, and also at the right time. As more people strive to understand this nature, scope, and consequences of such violence, it is also important to recognize are really powerful. I can mention some words like consent, gender, femicide, virginity test, war crimes, etc. So it is equally important to make sure that these international standards and words like, for example, do no harm and confidentiality are well understood and respected when engaging with the GBV and SGBV survivors. So in addition to all of this, in order to understand essential terms related to sexual and gender-based violence, we need also to be aware of the context. Many of the speakers mentioned the importance of the context when speaking about GBV. So we have also to understand this context in order to know how to address and which language we have to use in order to address these inequalities. And using this appropriate language shall also contribute to reducing this persistent under documentation and also under investigation and under prosecution of SGBV, which is a kind of deficiency partly rooted in this widespread misunderstanding of what SGBV is. So the context it occurs in and how do we interact with the survivors. So as such, the language is a starting point for me and for those who document and work with women and on raising awareness, conducting advocacy on issues related to GBV and the survivors. Allow me at last, Ayan, I want to mention something that on the other hand, we need also to expose always what's called gender or language aggression against women. Especially when discussing crimes of violence against women in public and also online. Now we cannot disregard the importance of online platforms in this discussion. And here I can mention some of the patriarchal strategies of abuse that me and many other feminists and women went through. Namely here I'm speaking about first, for example, minimizing the abuse and denying its existence at all in the language we use mainly in public and on social media. Also many practice verbal abuse and they use shaming, misogynic terms, bullying, hate speeches, and at many times death threats against women and human rights defenders and women. And also shifting, many times we see this shifting the discussion to attack and to promote the unusefulness of feminism, and also at many times blaming women and not believing women and the survivors. So these strategies relate to this social identity and gender stereotypes and bias, and exploring this language aggression against women reflects the critical role of language in constructing violence, creating inequality, and also justifying discrimination against women.
Are engaged and we are all on the same page before we go into the second round of questions. So put your questions on the chat and we'll share it. We'll give you guys a few seconds, sorry, not minutes. That's a great point, but we must also bear in mind that if women were put in powerful positions to design policies, that includes the GCC, they are probably going to pick state feminists who use narratives of liberal feminism and oppress other women with multiple underprivileges. Wow.
It is true that we'll have state feminists towing the government line when they design policies, but we also need to keep in mind that it's a start. And when I said we need women involved in policy design and implementation, I meant migrant women's voices being heard. I was speaking more from a civil society perspective because the civil society also in this space is dominated by voices that are not, from within the group, especially in the Gulf. We do hear in Kuwait, we have a domestic workers group. We have the IDWF working in Lebanon and across the GCC, but in small pockets. We are not hearing enough migrant women's voices in these discussions. Thank you.
In 1 or 2 sentences, can you share how you've seen a difference when you've applied pressure? So respectfully in your own institutions, in your own places. You can start with Nawal, and then Melissa, you can go second, and then we'll have Haya and Bani. So 1 sentence on how you saw change when you applied pressure in your space.
Okay, so because my focus specifically on disability, there were these changes were done morally, not legally. Please keep in mind that these changes were done by teachers who wanted to improve their education spaces. These were not pressured from educational institution or from the ministry. No, these were done by individuals who wanted to improve their educational spaces and make it inclusive. So the pressure essentially got to the educators in those spaces and that they took those responsibilities of making sure that their spaces are inclusive. So these were individual, I know this is longer than a minute, but it's just to make it more sense. That, because if I say it a one-liner, it won't really add up. That these were people essentially realize in their spaces that they need to make it inclusive. Even you need to do the right thing, even if a big entity is not on top of your head telling you what to do. They took a more responsibility as also as an educator, making sure that everyone is having their space. So this was what I realized, even though, I mean, but to me, I would consider this big, because this essentially taught other teachers who don't know that much about accessibility how to make their space more accessible. So that's pretty much what I can say. When you educate, even if one person changes, like in a good way, it plays like a domino effect. So the main thing is, even if you can teach one person, that is better than 100 people hearing you and doing nothing. So that's it.
Thank you. Very well said. And we're on time. Don't worry. I'm just getting everyone in, but we're on time. Don't worry about that. Melissa, would you like to go next?
So I think it's interesting, the idea that you put forth, Ayan, you know, if you introduce or say the word feminist, that in and of itself can be pressure to people. They hear something that feels threatening, because you're asking for something that they've interpreted. So when I think about where I've applied pressure, it is with questions, and a lot of them. I don't stop asking why. And I continue to put forth, from reading lists to libraries within my space, but also to be able to say, but why is it taught this way in this sense? And because I ask why over and over again, and then I ask my students to ask why, we create an echo chamber of whys, and you need an answer. And once somebody sees it, that has power or is within the system, they can open up. And what they're opening themselves up to is something called naming the injustice. So we've named it now because you've pointed to it. Now, once you've named it, I really don't want your apology. I need you to move forward from an apology. Sorry doesn't fix anything. So I don't actually want the apology. I don't want you to say you're sorry. Let's just move forward and make things better. And I think questions is the key point to applying pressure and kind of relentless questioning.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So audience, get your questions ready. The next time tomorrow, when you go into those spaces, start questioning everything and how it's working and what it's doing for inclusivity. Haya?
Already know that to close this gender gap, we need more than 100 years. So we have to be patient first, and we have to know that we are fighting against a really aggressive patriarchal system and patriarchal mentalities, and the change needs time. So we have to be patient and persistent all the time. But for me, the key words or the key actions that I believe that will lead to change, first, to always speak the truth to power, never compromise on our issues and on our values, and even if they made this pushback. And also, above all, the most important is solidarity among women. I believe that the change can come only from within the movement and from within the people who are the right holders, if I can say. So they are the change makers, and solidarity can make really a big difference.
Thank you. And Bani, one last closing sentence.
Yeah, I just want to, I remember James Baldwin's question, patient for how long? Give it time for how long, right? So I think we need to ask that and not be too patient, not give too much time, because it's been all our life, lifetime of us and everyone else. I'm going to borrow Nawal's fantastic line, the change that we've been able to bring about is more moral than legal, because there's no civil society space. You don't find active citizens being active in civil society spaces in most GCC countries. Bahrain and Kuwait are slightly different, so you see a different kind of conversation happening there. But because we struggle with this, what our organization did was we spoke to employers of domestic workers. We had repeated conversations, found peer ambassadors amongst them, and tried to see how we could change the way they hire, the way they employ, how they treat their domestic workers. It was, it was a very low bar, but we had to start somewhere. And we did see moral change, I must say.
Thank you. We've got 2 more questions. So we're going to try to nail it down because it relates to this part of the segment. I don't want to carry it forward with us to the next round. So one question is for Nawal, but really anyone that feels free to jump in. I am a disabled person in Kuwait. How can we shift accessibility not to be only thought of as accommodation or discussed through the legal aspect, but also as an ethical responsibility? Because what non-disabled people don't understand is that ableism harms them too. It holds capitalism, racism, and so forth. We should not normalize multiple ways of existing. Wow.
Basically, if you're born in a country, like say if you're born in the States and you're a disabled person, first you're recognized from that country. And second, if you can go to your center, like a rehabilitation center, and you can get a caretaker, and that will be provided by the state. Now, if you're a disabled person that's born in the GCC and you are not Khaliji, but your parents been there for 30, 40 years and you're disabled, you cannot have access just to basic care from a rehabilitation center. It's not provided to you because you're not seen as a citizen. So I think the legal aspect is very important. To even beat racism, you need to keep in the legal aspect. It's very important. I think when people are held accountable, firstly, the laws are important because it teaches people what is acceptable, what is not, and second, that they're being held accountable. So I think we cannot like beat racism or capitalism or something without going back to the legal system. So and because of the surrounding, we need to have constant awareness, conversations, so it gets to the people. So it gets heard by the people in power who can listen to our conversations and concerns and show how beneficial it is for these changes to be done. So we cannot expect ethical responsibility if they're not even there in the legal system to begin with. So that's just my point of view. But if anyone wants to bring anything else, then I'm open to that. But I think we cannot bring ethical responsibility without laws being there, ethical laws being there.
Thank you so much, Nawal. Melissa, I saw you play with your nodding your head there. Do you would like to add something?
From my perspective, that question is it's multiplicative in nature, and it reminds me of Alice Walker's poem, "I will deny myself nothing." So she's saying in her poetry that she is all of the things, and stop asking her to deny any portion of what she is. And I think in many spaces we are asked to compartmentalize ourselves and say we are this one thing in one place, or that's the box we fit in, when we aren't boxes, we're humans. And I think that idea that Ayat had said, we should normalize multiple ways of existing, but not just multiple ways of existing, but that we are multiple things at once. We are not one thing at one time at all times. All of those things are intersectional in nature as a human. And so from ableism to sexism to capitalism to colonialism and all of the things that history has brought us and has told us we need to be or not to be, then I think we're framing it quite limited. And if we just allow ourselves to deny ourselves nothing, we are all of those things. And I'm not going to deny everything that I am, because I am all of those things. And maybe I'm a teacher in one moment and a mother in another moment. And those are roles I play, but I possess all of those identities at once. And we all do, based on who we are and where we fall as humans. So that's really important to me to think about.
Thank you so much. And Haya, we've got a very nice question for you, and intellectual. When language matters, what do you think about the use of the words expat, migrant, household workers, worker, and the privileges associated with them? So these are labels, this is language, this is compartmentalizing. So what are your views on that, Haya?
Well, I think that it is important, and we had an example here from the man who entered the chat, the Zoom link. So I think that it is important when speaking about these variables related to the language and to the terms that we use to identify people and put people into boxes. We have to be aware of one of the things that I mentioned in the introduction, which is the harm. So we have to be aware how much harm we are causing to the people based on what language we are speaking with them. And that's why we usually encourage a gender-sensitive language that pushes more into humanizing the way we target everyone in every day, in every speech.
Thank you so much. Okay, wow. Thank you all for all those insightful questions, and I hope that has helped you, but we're gonna have to move on now to the second segment. In light of all the inequalities and negative treatment girls and women face from marginalized communities, what are the impact of this trauma on human development, and how does it prevent migrant women and children from having ownership to live a life of dignity and peace?
To bring in how inequalities in migration and treatment of labor migration, regardless of gender, will have an impact on women and girls. Because these are families we are talking about. We're talking about family as a unit, to be separated from your spouse just because you don't earn enough or you're not considered a skilled worker, even if you're an essential worker. So we need to look at how these inequalities for one gender will end up impacting all, so to keep that in mind. And the other thing is, when the temptation is to talk about women and children together. We see this in the UN language, we see it in conferences, and that is a little bit problematic, because you will have a conversation around human rights as a whole, and then rights of women and children. And I am very, very aware how inequalities affect women and children more deeply. But I also think we need to stop clubbing that together, because it infantilizes the women, because it brings about a certain degree of protection. Women don't need to be protected. You provide an environment that is equal and safe for everyone, women are going to be equal and safe. We don't need a protection entrusted upon us, because that will come with strings. There'll be strings attached that will come with controls. People will decide what is good for you and what is not good for you. And also, when we talk about women and children, the emphasis becomes on the woman as a mother. And we've seen this in migration. For instance, you see in Sri Lanka, women who are mothers of children under the age of 5 cannot migrate. They place bans, which means they cannot migrate regularly. They will end up migrating all the same, because they do not have employment options. They have to feed the children, they have to get them to school. So the women will migrate, but now they'll be more vulnerable, because they'll migrate through irregular channels. Because a woman's role is only seen as a mother, but she's also a provider. She's got the skills to provide. And we need to make sure that environment takes all of this into consideration. In the ideal world, money doesn't buy happiness, but it does. If nothing else, it buys security. So you have to be from an extremely privileged point to say that money is not the most important thing. It is. The reason that this has to be taken into account when we look at inequalities is, what is women's access to financial products in the Gulf? One, what is migrant workers, lower income migrant workers, access to financial services and products in the Gulf? It's limited. What is women's access? It's non-existent. What is women's access to borrowing and saving back home? Very limited, very, very narrow. So how do they manage their money? They depend on the men in their families to manage their money. So we need to start looking at things about how women interact with various systems that we take for granted as privileged, educated women or men. That is not the norm for most people. So if you're a domestic worker in the Gulf, I'm going back to domestic work simply for one reason, because that is the lowest rung of empowerment within brackets. Even if they need to remit money, they depend on their kafil to remit the money, because for them to step out of the house and go out, there's no access to public transport in most of the Gulf countries. It's not affordable to take a taxi. You depend on someone else. So what is women's access to public transport in the Gulf? All women, so the rich women, the privileged women may drive, they might have drivers. What happens to the rest of them? If they don't have access to public transport, they don't have access to most essential services. So we need to start looking at how all of this plays into it, and what the trauma is. When you do not have access to essential services, you live in isolation, you're invisible. So you spend all of your contracted term or beyond literally imprisoned in someone's home, where you need to depend on them for every little thing. Leave home, buy your sanitary pads, buy your basic essentials, everything you depend on someone else. That also internalizes their inferiority in many ways. They feel they're not capable of doing it. But we see women who break that barrier and start doing it will start encouraging other women to do. So while we speak about trauma of being denied, we need to speak about what happens when women break that barrier and do things. They, they help bring up stronger sons, stronger daughters, more sensitive sons and more sensitive daughters. They're able to have conversations with women who do not have that knowledge. So these are the things, these are the barriers that we need to really try to break down to reduce the trauma. I did mention the Sri Lanka's ban on women traveling, right? And this is the first reaction for all governments. If women face trouble, be it sexual harassment in the workplace, or not being paid, or being killed, which happens more often than it should, the first reaction is to ban their migration. The first reaction is not to legally hold the culprits accountable and put them behind bars. It's to stop that migration, as if the problem exists only because of women's mobility. So I'm not answering your question in terms of the trauma, but I'm talking about all the ways in which the system prevents women from accessing the most basic of services that will prevent their trauma and help other people. I don't have strong answers, but I truly believe better access to financial services, public transport is the way to ensure that isolation is broken, that women become more visible.
Over to Noel. What challenges do you still face as a result of the inequalities you experienced early on? So it's going on from what we've just did about how it's trauma is long-term. So would you like to share those challenges with us, Noel?
Yes. I think because of my environment, I never took the time, or rarely took the time to sit and focus how it impacted me, that I just adapted to the situations. I was very young. I think it was not healthy, but I just adapted to my environment, so what was given to me, which is not healthy in the long run, because I think it makes me not value what I do enough. So I feel like what I'm doing is not good enough in the first place, because like, say, my surrounding of, say, people who I was in school with now are working, they have, a degree, and I feel like maybe my work is not. And also those employment opportunities, right? As a woman with a disability, if you're not educated, you're already seen as you're not good enough to work because of your disability. And then not having an education background it makes you even not good enough, if that makes sense, because it's because it's essentially we have to work double to be seen as equal. So being a double minority, in a sense, I have to work 3 times as hard to be seen as equal. So I think those are one of the things, right? That, okay, if you're not educated, you lack those economic opportunities. Okay, right now I depend on my parents, but when they pass away, who will look after me, right? So, and I'll be basically the stats right? We have stats on the UN, on those stats where they're saying adults, 97% of adults with disabilities don't get their education. I'm that stat basically. And essentially, I'll be the stats that you'll read on the UN website of women with disabilities that are either exploited or underprivileged eventually, right? So how do we stop these women from becoming a statistic? If that makes sense. And I think those are one of the very big things is that those opportunities that would be provided to others because of the resources or the environment are not the same for people with disabilities when they're not given these very basic access. And then when those basic access are maybe given, they're more prioritized to men with disabilities because they're seen as, end of the day, okay, he has a disability, but he will be a provider. And essentially, if you're a woman and with a disability, essentially they think because you're not normalized, you're not seen as anything else, then I'm taking so long. But yeah, I think these are one of the big things that when I was young, people thought my education, like, it's better to send me abroad in a boarding school, or that my education is not important because I'm a girl with a disability. So, you know, at the end of the day, maybe I'll get married off as like a second or third wife to someone or something. So it's not as important. And those are the views that were being pushed on surrounding wise, right? So I think what comes down to all of now is that what I built in the past, due to my education being taken away, I'm not, even though I work pretty hard at where I am right now, but those same economic opportunities are not given to me just because I don't have a degree. That's the only reason, even though I have the same skill set, I have the same experiences, I have maybe more work experiences than people who have like a high school diploma or even a degree right out of college. But I'll be not seen as equal or equally equally capable just because I don't have a degree. That's just plain and simple. And that plays a very big role that if education is not only from a degree, that it is from your life experiences, it is from what you learn morally, because anyone can have a master's or a PhD. It doesn't mean they're a good person, and definitely doesn't mean that they're experienced enough just because they have that one piece of paper. Yeah, that's it. So that's pretty much what I need to say.
Thank you so much, Nawal. And I just going back to having heard what Nawal has just kindly shared with us, what influence do you think the education system has on addressing agency in society? I know you've done amazing work. You've been Doha's local celebrity when it comes to getting youths to be engaged and being actively participating in change. So please share that with us.
So the question, you know, we have to dissect certain words because we are talking about language and how we look at things. So there is not one education system. I think that's key in looking at things. And when we talk about influence can look and feel very different to big waves, to small waves, to pebbles. And when we look at education as this idea that we're pursuing knowledge for this said degree that she had said, you know, this piece of paper that says I am something, that's the language of colonialism, because we're talking about an institution that says this degree means something and it places value. But if the language of colonialism has told me that my mother tongue is not important enough to have a lexical space, then that degree means absolutely nothing to spaces that are orally gifted. And I think when we think about this pursuit of knowledge, if we miss out on analysis and we are just bringing forth rote memorization of said skills that someone says is important, or rote memorization of dates and facts of some white men who did something and we put a statue up for them. I think what's important is to continue that why part, and that's what agency again is about. Is I have to go to people who I love, and Zora Neale Hurston was famously quoted, and if you're silent about your pain, then everyone will speak for you. Tell them that you liked it. They'll speak up for you if you choose not to engage in that voice. And agency is the freedom and the capacity to make our own choices. So if I choose to be quiet in a space, it's because I chose to, not because someone silenced me or changed my words as I was speaking. So when I do units with my students, I'm trying to bring forth both the author, and I'm trying to bring them forth alive, not necessarily just in the text, and that has to do with looking at current events, from Black Lives Matter, the revolution that actually was televised. How do we parse out the headlines? How do we look beyond the headlines? Who's being spoken to? Who's being spoken about? Who's getting quoted? Who's not getting quoted? And to apply the Bechdel test on everything we look at, and just to always have a critical eye. It doesn't mean you can't enjoy life, but I think without asking the questions, we end up in this dichotomous space that says it's either or, and it's never both and. And if we just keep either oring the whole space, we lose out on the ability to name who and what we are and all the things we are as females, as humans, and all of our abilities. And there's this idea that if we're not speaking it, it doesn't exist. There's this concept of nomo. I have to put it out there for it to exist. There's power in word, spoken word, and it doesn't have to be on a degree or a piece of paper. It is experience, but it's also speaking it up, and that idea that more voices become louder, and that's what we're doing, and that's what you're doing, Ayan, with voicing voices, and that's what this conversation, I believe, is about. So I think about the language and the colonial tongue. I teach English, so that's a really convoluted space. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a famous author, and he chooses not to write in English anymore because he's tired of it. He's tired of it being the lingua franca. And I think that that's important, that we give space also to multiple ways of speaking. Sign language is not necessarily honored in lots of educational spaces. And that's an interesting thing to ask why. We don't have to have the answer, but we have to have the questions, and we have to ask the questions.
And we've got Haya. What impact have you seen? Because you've actually gone in and you've spoken to these communities, and you've tried to build that agency with different countries within the GCSE and within GCC and abroad. So what happened in that situation when you tried to create awareness about gender sensitive content?
Here, Ayan, I want to mention that when speaking about awareness raising, for me, I divide it into 3 levels. The first level is the general public. The second level is the people who have the authority and who are obviously men, from religious leaders and from political parties, etc. And also we are speaking about women and girls. For me, the most favorite part is speaking with women and girls, and I will leave it till the end. So, but it is not easy at all to address these issues. And here I want to clarify the point that I was mentioning about patience. It is related to the context. First of all, in order to, as a feminist, I want the change tomorrow. But as an advocacy person who've worked for more than 12 years on ground on different issues related to women's rights, I am very well aware about the power dynamics, about how the patriarchal system and norms are rooted in our societies and affecting women also, and not only men. We have many women in our societies who are duplicating these patriarchal norms and traditions and everything, because unfortunately they are raised in this way. And they are told that this is the right, and by using these gender stereotypes and roles, you're protecting yourself and you're protecting your daughter, etc. And also because they pay the price every time they want to face this patriarchal system. So understanding the context is very important, and this is what we usually do without compromising. As I already mentioned, we never compromise in our language or on our demands related to women's rights, but we know what language to use at what times and in which context. So this was just a clarification, and this is important when speaking about awareness raising, because we want to avoid being blocked in many countries in the Arab world. You already heard about many women and human rights defenders who were arrested. Many were killed, okay, because of their speeches, of everything. So what we usually do is to be vocal, to be loud, but at the same time to ensure the protection of the women and the girls who are on the front lines and whom we are working with. So this is very important in the way of awareness we usually do with the public. And for us, with the public, having very direct and clear messages is very important as well. This has brought a change in what context, Ayan? It brought a change in the context that Melissa mentioned in the beginning, which is that we imposed our rights as a priority on the table for decision makers in the houses, in universities, in schools. For example, in Lebanon, the feminist movement succeeded to make women's rights issues and laws, protection, everything a debatable issue, to inform the debate about it. And this was done through campaigning and awareness raising and etc. On the level of decision makers and religious leaders, because in many countries they have the big authority when it comes to women's bodies and women's issues, and they interfere in every single detail related to our lives. So we try to be as much as radical, but also as much as smart in, if I can say, tailoring our advocacy messages to try to take an achievement after the other. For example, in Lebanon, we have 15 personal status laws. These are religious status laws. They discriminate not only between men and women, but also between women from different sects. So, and they have a big authority in the country, not allowing any reforms in terms of laws that can lead to a kind of a civil state. So what we usually do is that we have this kind of demand that we want a civil law for all, but at the same time we try to use different tactics through amending some laws like child marriage law, custody law, etc. So you have to use different tactics in this domain. Finally, when it comes to women and girls, for me this is the best part of the story, because again, I believe that the change have to come from women and girls. They will be the change makers. Over history, we never had any gain in the women's rights movement that was given as a gift or something for us. Always we took our rights and our demands by power, by advocacy, by struggle, by paying the price. So for me, solidarity is the best, and this is what I try to emphasize with every and each woman I talk to. Even if these women are from different backgrounds, and many of them are from conservative backgrounds, I try to encourage them to be aware of how this patriarchal system affected them at the first place. So avoiding lecturing and speaking about their own experiences, and you will hear amazing things, because the problem is that at many times, women are not told that these norms and culture and etc. are discriminatory against you. They are told that this is the normal and you have to abide by it. The tactic that I use usually working with women and girls is trying to listen to their experiences, linking these experiences together, and encouraging solidarity and ways of facing this patriarchal system. It had brought a lot of change. Actually, but again, I say that we don't have, in our feminist work, we don't have the privilege of losing hope or feeling tired or giving up. We have to understand the barriers and the challenges, and we have to walk until the end to face them.
That was so perfect. And I think Banan and Aya, my sisters in solidarity, as well as our sisters in Qatar, would agree the importance of solidarity. And I think that's this approach that we are taking. If we don't have time to, we've received 3 questions for this segment and we don't have enough time. So what we're going to do is going to pick one. And if we finish at the end, we'll come back to these other 2. How does that sound? So the first question we had was, how can we ensure that advocacy in social media is tangible when it comes to women's rights?
Yes, unfortunately, we cannot ensure, but we have to do it. So because now social media and the digital world are playing a very powerful role in everything, as I mentioned, it is a double-ended sword. At many times it brings opportunities, but also and many times it brings challenges, and it brings hate speech and misogyny, as I mentioned. So we cannot ensure, but we have to do this role. And I can say from certain experiences, at many times using social media to advocate for women's issues was powerful, and we have a lot of success stories in this domain. So even if we fail in one occasion, it will work after all, because it is a platform. For me, as women and girls, we have to make use of every and each platform, accessible platform. And it is our right to be present there on digital media and on all other platforms. So we have to practice it despite all.
Thank you so much. So we're going to go to a third segment that we've been waiting for, and we've only got half an hour left. Time flies. So we'll get to practical solutions and tips that we can give you so that when you leave this discussion, you can act upon it. And we're going to start with Melissa. What advice would you give to other educators and education systems so they can provide safe spaces for marginalized communities?
So I'll speak specifically to my space. And when I think about this idea, I think about Fannie Lou Hamer and This Little Light of Mine, and this idea that I can, when I liberate myself, and this idea of self-knowledge of who I am and all of the parts of who I am, I'm able to liberate others because I show my humanity in all of its forms. So my sadness, sometimes I need to be quiet, sometimes I need to dance, sometimes I need to be all of these things. And that space allows all of my students, even if I don't know they're in a marginalized space, because perhaps I'm new to that space. As an economic immigrant myself, moving from country to country, teaching in different spaces, I may or may not know who is not marginalized in my classroom, especially right at the beginning of the year. So this idea that nobody is free until everybody's free, and the idea that we can each have voice. In my classroom, in an education space, you let each person tell their own story. So I've watched 7th graders and 6th graders and 12th graders and 11th graders try to tell a story of someone else. And it's because they think they're friends, and they're like, let me tell you what happened. No, I don't want to know what happened from you. Were you there? Because it's her or his story. And it's her or his story to tell with her or his words. Just like when we read a biography, that is, or an autobiography, that is their words. They're telling you who they are. So if they're telling you who they are, stop doubting what they've said they are, and stop asking if that is true. Stop asking, but who are you really? But what are you really? All of those questions go back to that idea of infantilization that our guest had mentioned before. I don't need your help to speak. I have a voice. I just need you to be quiet and listen. So as a teacher, I can silence the over talkers, perhaps. I can say, well, wait, you'll have a turn. We got to make sure everybody has this opportunity to voice themselves as themselves, in and of themselves, in the language that they speak, through whatever way that they want to do it. And within an educational space, that also looks like, maybe I'm not oral, maybe I'm a very good writer, maybe I'm a good actress, maybe I'm really good at these other things. And those abilities that we provide should look again, in the educational space, that you can prove and demonstrate your worth in multiple ways. I don't need to grade just your essay or just your speech. How do you want to prove to me this new knowledge or this ability to analyze? So I think within the education space, and we're talking about safe spaces, I need you to feel safe enough to express yourself as you are. and from whence you have come. And I'll help you get through the rubric, and I'll help you get through the grammar, and I'll help, but I'm not going to speak for you, and I'm not going to tell you what words to write. I'm going to tell you how to craft it so maybe your connotative space is better. What audience are you actually trying to get to, whether it's a social media space, and how do we craft our language to be more impactful? When we feel like it needs to be impactful in certain spaces, of course we edit, of course we make better our language. But I think if we have our own voice, from that we can push out. And I don't like the idea of one way to think of safe spaces also. What I think is safe may or may not be what another person thinks is safe. And I would much rather provide opportunities for them to tell me. And so again, I keep going back to, I keep asking why or what or how come. And that why opens up discussion and discourse for others to be able to tell me, because I am not the knower or the pourer in of the knowledge. I am the one who can just catalyze a discussion and facilitate a safe discussion. Perhaps my job is just to facilitate a safe discussion that allows all the voices to come as they are. And so when I think about education, that's how I think about my role. My activism lives within the space that I contain with my students. And if that bleeds out over the walls into other places because my students do that in other places, then I will do that.
Thank you so much for all the work that you do continuously. And Haya, we'll come to you. Say we're not educators and we're not in any form of system or position of privilege. What can we do as individual members of society who may not even be aware of the cause? So forget about positions of privilege. They may not be even aware of the cause, to take responsibility for the injustices experienced by women and children?
That we can address all these inequalities. I can say, obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning, that of course, I totally agree with Melissa and with the importance of education. And I really learned a lot from what she said about how it's important to question and everything, and to teach our children to question. So from here, I want to mention that it is important to start from within the families, from the way we raise the children. We don't have to tell them that there is something that is sacred, something that you cannot question or you cannot explore, if I can say. So starting within the family is very important. Also believing women, because as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a big problem in the way that society deals with gender-based violence, and it is at many times in purpose. The way we try to silence women and the way we don't believe survivors, and we give excuses one after the other for all forms of violence. So start supporting and believing women, especially survivors of different forms of violence and from all backgrounds, because we are speaking about intersectionality. So if she is a migrant domestic worker, this doesn't mean that she is less privileged to hear for her, or a woman with disability, or from the LGBT community, or etc. One of the important things is to adopt a zero tolerance for violence in our houses, in our schools, in our workplaces, in our relations with everyone, and to report violence. In our communities, we miss this culture of reporting because, unfortunately, they view violence against women as a personal issue. And here we repeat what many of our fellow feminists advocated and struggled for in the second wave of feminism, which is personal is political. We cannot anymore speak about women's or the marginalized issues as personal issues that should be solved, for example, between the abused woman and her husband, or the abused woman and her father. So it is a political issue indeed, and we have all the responsibility to report and to work tirelessly to provide the power, more power and more freedom for girls, for women, more spaces for them to express themselves. And when speaking about spaces, I want also to emphasize media and social media as spaces, because until this day, we are still underrepresented in media, stereotyped, objectified, excuses are given for violence against us, and continuous, again and again, continuous advocacy and solidarity around women's issues.
Thank you so much. Well put together. Third question for Nawal. To make sure we protect the disability rights of every child who might be going through what you went through growing up, what can we have in place in educational settings to help students and parents as well? Because Nawal, you're in a very unique position where you saw the spaces within the education system, you saw the spaces within the family and how your parents were supported, and you've seen the spaces as a student. So as a young child growing up and witnessing these injustices.
I think is to educate people before they become parents, is that they need to expect having, if they plan to have children, they need to accept if their child comes out disabled. These are very big things that before people become parents, they need to be educated that if their child has a disability, they need to accept it because their child didn't choose to be here. They were brought here. So whatever their child's life decision or how they come out is, end of the day, the parents' responsibility. This is a very big issue when it comes to the disability community, of how the parents eventually deal with it, because they're not even aware of disability. Speaking for the past generations, they were not educated on disability. So now when they have a child with a disability, they're automatically, their families tell them they don't see the importance of them being educated or put in classes where they're able to be independent and provide for themselves for the long run. This is in the long run perspective, because it also affects of how parents who have children with disabilities see their own child, because then that shows where the parents want to see their child be. So it's educating people, like people in society, that before they become parents, they need to accept their child. And second part is that we educate. So I started very small, but I saw the impact of it. So I made these guides on disability etiquette, on how parents can understand disability and teach it to their child. So it's very important that parents teach their children about disability and show them cartoons and books where they see disability so normalized that when they go into the educational spaces or even public spaces, they're not shocked by it. And I saw this with my siblings too, even myself, because I had an invisible disability, and when I went into spaces where there were children with physical disabilities, which I was never exposed to, I was so shocked. I was like, I didn't know how to I didn't know how to behave, right? Because I was never exposed to it. I was never normalized to it. So and even my siblings were shocked themselves, and because we were never exposed to it, right? My siblings only got exposed because of me. So it's exposing children to movies, books, educational materials where they bring disability in, but not focusing on the disability, but in a more of the narrative perspective that normalizes them. So when children go in educational, they ask those why questions to their educators. Okay, why is their needs not being provided? Why is she not studying in the same room as me, right? In educational spaces, UB children, even, what I've seen on my own experiences is that even if the child has just a physical disability, they're separated to a different room, and that is not inclusion, that is separation, and that doesn't normalize a child. That it becomes they them. It makes a they versus us, when we need to be, we're all in this together. It's not them versus me, it's all of us together, and that's how we can move on. So I took so long, I'm so sorry. Yeah, that's it. So it's all of us environment, not they versus us, but We're all in this together. So children ask questions in their educational spaces, and they become more aware as teens that if they see this uh, basic space or material not being provided, that they question their teachers and their systems. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So sorry, yeah, I'm done.
We decide to organize something, be it a webinar or a physical conference, hello COVID, make sure that it's inclusive, it's accessible, you have interpreters. The reason that I want to highlight this is 2 Women's Days ago, 2 Marches ago in Qatar, there was a futurist female conference and there was a panel discussion I was on. I was the only Asian origin person. I'm an Indian passport holder. And at the end of the panel, so many of the young students came up and said, we never see ourselves reflected there, because the Asians they would see in forums that matter to them were the Asians who held, a Western passport. So here they saw someone speaking their accent, looking like them. And I was quite stunned because this is 2 years ago. And that was true 20 years ago when I moved to Qatar in 1999, 22 years ago. And it's still true, which means no one has taken the effort to reflect what the population actually looks like. The media does not reflect it. What you will see media reporting is abuse. It doesn't show success stories. It doesn't show true stories. It doesn't give a platform for migrants to express themselves. You don't see them reflected. I'm not talking only about lower income. I'm talking about middle income migrants with families. They are not reflected in the media. They're not allowed to be included. They're in the periphery of all this glitz, right? Now we need to break that, because unless you break that, you're not going to suddenly allow lower income migrant women to be included in these spaces. So we need to start breaking down how migrants are viewed based on their ethnicity, class, how they look, etc., etc. One of the things that we did in migrant rights is the stories of origin, which came out as an anthology, the book, is to go to origin countries and tell the stories, those stories of people, the human stories of where they come from, who their families are, how the similarities far outweigh the differences. And it's in English and Arabic. And that really received, and I've done a few sessions with students in terms of them just thinking about the people who work at home. So who is their nanny? Who's the person they grew up with? Who's the driver? They start looking at them differently because they now have a picture of where they come from. Otherwise, the conversations have always been transactional. You go to a cafe and ask for a cup of coffee and you leave. You don't even address the person by name. So these are the small things. Start looking at people. Start having conversations. Don't be intrusive. Don't ask a question and expect a question not to be asked in return. So also respect their privacy. Have these conversations with people, which are so important, first of all, to understand where the other comes from, and then to respect them. Because if you don't know their stories, you will not respect them. You will not just respect a face, unless it's a white person, I'm sorry, because that's the world we live in, right? And then look at the ways in which women's leisure, there's an obstacle to women accessing leisure. All women, particularly low income migrant women, where will they go on their off day if they're lucky enough to get an off day? If they're lucky enough to be allowed outside, where do they go? What are the movie theaters? In Qatar, there was a movie theater in the middle of the city, which had cheap tickets, showed Asian language movies. They removed it and put it in an industrial area where all those single men live. So women's access to that leisure is now out of bounds. Where do women go then? If they're not Christian and not religious and don't want to go to the church on a Friday, where will they go? Start looking at it, start creating spaces if you have the power to, start having those conversations. And we spoke about social media, right? In the beginning, and Melissa had this fantastic point about language. Somehow, even in the Arab world, English is mainstreamed. English language proficiency is seen as intelligence, is seen as knowledge, and that's not true. So when we try to include migrant women in spaces around domestic work and stuff, oh, they may not be able to communicate. Okay, that's not their problem. You take the effort to get an interpreter so you understand the really important stories and truths they have to say. And social media, again, there was, in some of the research we've done, we see that over 60% of female domestic workers do not have access to their phone. It's taken away from them. That is their lifeline when they can't go out. They interact with their families on Facebook. They have fun on Facebook. They do TikTok videos. You take that away from them and you don't provide an alternative physical space. It's a cruelty unimaginable, right? We went through 2 months of COVID lockdown. We all were going crazy, but this is their life and this is their reality. So how can you provide, first of all, don't interfere with their access to communication. It's not your business. If you have a problem with privacy, have that conversation with them. Tell them you don't want your children's photos to be taken and put on social media, but you can't take away that access to phone, for instance. Allow women, I mean, it's not even to allow, but don't prevent them from going out. Don't prevent them from enjoying an off day. These are the small things that you can have. And when you see something, say something. I'm a Harry Potter fan. I'm sorry, I know J.K. Rowling went off the rails, but there's this line, right? Standing up to your enemies is easy, but standing up to your friends requires real courage. That's the thing. Stand up to your families, stand up to your friends. Don't try to change the world. Just change the family you live in, the friends you associate with. You go to a party and you see someone being disrespectful to the person serving. Tell them off. Say it politely. Have that conversation. Otherwise, things are not going to change. I'll stop here.
Okay, mute. Okay. Thank you so much, Avani. That was really nice. And it was a nice way of kind of really wrapping up the conversation. I wanted so badly to get into the questions because there were so many, but I'm going to stick to one. Please bear in mind that we have an event coming up at the end of the month, which we've got your email addresses, so we'll try to invite you again all. But the one question that we have from the audience that I'm hoping we can squeeze in, we only got 5 minutes left over before the closing remarks, is to what extent is it important to invite men into the conversation?
It's important to have men in the discussion. If we don't have men in the discussion, we will not be able to move forward, because it's not, when there's women's rights, those are equally men's rights, and educating them that when our rights are being taken away, their right is being taken away. And we cannot have equality without having everyone on the table, right? So this is even includes gender. So it's teaching men how to, well, particularly younger men need to be educated, right? And we cannot have those education there if they're not included in the conversation. So I think that they do play a very big role of, I think this is where, sometimes the line is crossed, but having them on the table, that validating that their support is equally important to have any impact. But I think others would like to bring in something. I think Hayat wanted to speak.
Thank you, Noel.
Yes, I wanted to mention something because it is important that we are always asked as feminist movement and as feminists to bring men to the table. I want to mention something. It is important not to leave anyone behind when speaking about awareness, when speaking about everything related to women's rights. But there are two main points we have to always keep in mind for me as a feminist. First, who is leading on the agenda that is related to women's rights, who is taking the decisions on everything related to our rights, to our movement, to our lives, to our bodies, etc. I think that the only people who should be leading this conversation are women and girls. And also the second point is that not to be under this pressure of all the time saying, okay, feminists, you never bring men to the table. At many times, men don't want to come to the table. This is a fact.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah, this is the fact. They don't want to come to the table. And if they came, they dominate this table. And at many times, we want to keep in mind that many men are benefiting from this power dynamics, and they have the privilege because of these patriarchal norms. So just I wanted to raise only these 2 points for discussion. Thank you.
Vani, you have your hand raised?
Yeah. I don't know about bringing to the table, but I think they should definitely be part of these conversations. Again, I would always say start small, have the conversations to begin with your sons and your husbands and your fathers and your brothers, because they might be a little bit more open. When you suddenly bring a man, they're going to be woke, right? I mean, that's the language of the day. They're going to say the right things, whether they mean it or not. You're not going to have meaningful conversations in public spaces with men around feminism. They will be performative, and we don't need that. So I think it would be a really good, it's a good start to have these conversations with your children. And also, I'm a mother of two daughters, a preteen and a teen and a young adult. And I have those conversations. I try and give them the language to speak to boys about, feminism, because sometimes children need that help, right? When a boy says, oh, women are dumb, girls are dumb, the immediate reaction is to cry or say, oh, boys are dumb. But how can you change that? And a little bit of guidance on that, helping young girls to have that conversation with their friends, because those are the most honest conversations that are going to be happening around feminism in that age group. That's it.
Thank you. And Melissa, do you want to drop a few gems, especially, you are dealing with classrooms that have boys and girls. So how do you intersect that when you're in these kind of spaces and having these conversations?
So that's so interesting. In the classroom, that's a different dynamic, because there is a peer policing I watch and I observe. The peers police each other with looks, perhaps, and that's not for me to be part of, but I'm observant to it. And so if there is, I think what I try to do within the classroom is that when someone speaks up and there is a ruffled feather or two, I will generally, as the facilitator, ask for them to continue, please, and encourage them to continue to ruffle the feathers. But I do so in a way that maybe just looks like I'm really curious for the person to engage a little further. And then there's further questions that will come up by the ruffled feathers, and they get louder and louder and louder and louder. But it's interesting because that self-policing that arrives, you get peer support. And when there is solidarity within the classroom, it helps with encouraging the male counterparts to listen. And so I don't have to do a lot as long as I amplify the right voices and open the spaces and say, oh, that's interesting, tell me more. So I think I'm just a little bit more of a person who's clapping in the background to say, oh, wait a minute, give me more of that. Hold tight, we're gonna come to you in just a minute. Listen to her for a second before you jump in with your idea. So I think that's how I do it, at least within the classroom.
Again, Melissa, Haya, Nawal, Vani, my sisters, Binan and Aya, and my sisters in Qatar, thank you all so much for making this happen. And I look forward to us uniting together as sisters in solidarity. So thank you.
Yeah, really, thank you. It was an honor having you all as a guest. It was really nice and interesting, and I felt like it was a support circle for women to really share themselves. Thank you all, yeah, for this birth of Sister of Solidarity.
Thank you.